I want to go ahead and begin by welcoming everyone to Independent Sector's Week in Washington, discussing the advocacy and policy impacting nonprofits in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Allison Grayson with Independent Sector. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to the call. Today we're joined by Lucy Bernholz with the Stanford Digital Civil Society Lab and Washington Council Ernst & Young's Wes Coulomb. A little bit of housekeeping. As a part of our call, all lines are currently muted and we will pause periodically for questions. To ask a question, please email publicpolicy@independentsector.org or type it into the Q&A box on Zoom. The event will be recorded and posted on the Independent Sector website and emailed to you within 24 hours of this webinar. And then when you leave the call today, you'll be prompted to take a survey, which we encourage you to fill out so that we can better tailor the content to your needs. And we look forward to your questions today, and we appreciate your attendance and engagement. So with that, we're going to get started, but I want to start with acknowledging the events of the last week. Although this call is about federal policy and COVID, I want to talk about the fact that we have seen millions of people across the country raise their voices in the last week demanding change in response for the killing of George Floyd. As Lucy put it before we started, we're seeing civil society in full force. This activism has yielded results already, but as we also have heard this week, President Obama has noted that there's a need to translate the activism into public policy and long-term systemic change, particularly at the local and state levels. Historically, nonprofits have been the ones to help people figure out how to make their voices heard through policy advocacy and voting. And it's apparent that this role remains critically important. And we need to make sure that we align our efforts as nonprofits behind the organizations that have the African American and other communities of color. Now, we've already acknowledged that a lot of the reform and policy change on the racial justice issues that have been dominating conversation last week are at the state and local levels. So we haven't seen a lot of activity at the federal level. However, federal policy is advancing that impacts the nonprofits we've already said are on the ground doing work in their communities to advance racial justice. So we still want to hear about what's happening in Washington, D.C., even if that's not where all the action is. We're going to turn to Wes Coulomb to give us a brief update this week in Washington. Wes, can you give us a summary of what's happening since no one is paying attention to what's happening in Washington this week?
Thank you, Allison. That is correct. There's things going on, but the attention is definitely focused elsewhere. The Senate is in session this week, and they did pass yesterday some modifications to the PPP Paycheck Protection Program for small, mid-sized organizations, nonprofits, and small businesses. To extend out the loan forgiveness window for that and make some other modifications to the program. That's on its way to the president's desk today or tomorrow. So that's one thing they've done in the Senate, make some modifications to that program. The Senate is processing some more nominations today, and then the House is out of session. And they've, since they passed the large HEROES Act a week or so ago, they've gone out of session through till the end of June, and basically tune this period as a period of committee work period for the committees to do some hearings and some markups of their individual legislation. And then with the idea to come back at the end of the month to deal with those items the committees have processed in that time. The House has indicated, however, that given response to George Floyd, that they are possibly considering coming back a week or so early to consider some civil rights policing reforms towards the end of this month. So they may come back early to deal with some of those issues that are obviously front and center for the nation.
Thanks, Wes. So
I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah, sure.
Great. And as a reminder, if you have questions, please feel free to write them into the Q&A box for Wes. Wes, it sounds like a lot of the activity is sort of planning for future policy discussions. So there's a lot of background conversations. Where in this process are nonprofits seeing the greatest opportunities to sort of influence discussions in the next week or so?
Yeah, that's good. Good question. The Senate, as I said, is in session this week and will be in session next week. So those senators are in town doing activities here. The House members, for the most part, unless they have community responsibilities, are for the most part back in their home states or districts. So from the House perspective, that's the place to catch them or to be active with them is back home. As I mentioned, the HEROES Act, which is a follow-on to the CARES Act to kind of further provide tax relief for individuals and organizations, modifications of the Employee Retention Tax Credit, the PPP program, more spending across the board in various areas for relief for individuals, some tax and other tax payments to individual taxpayers as part of that package, $3 trillion package. So that really sits in the Senate to respond to that. So I think most of the activity has been kind of shifted over to the Senate to see what Leader McConnell and Leader Schumer can work out as far as a product that they can move on a bipartisan basis through the Senate at some point in the next month or two. My guess is timing on that is going to be not very fast. Leader McConnell in particular is not eager to move a bill too quickly through his chamber. We might see potentially a Republican bill in response as the first offer, and then obviously anything that needs to be passed through the Senate will have to get bipartisan, both Republican and Democrat votes, and so both Leader Schumer and Leader McConnell will have to find a way to engage and get a product they can both agree to, as well as the administration. The administration will be involved in that process as well in the Senate. So that's going to be an ongoing process. It's going to take the next several weeks. Probably not be come to more together on the package until end of June, first part of July is more likely the timing for that larger package. And so people have issues with that package, with the issues they want to fix. Obviously, the nonprofit sector is interested in modifying PPP, with also the mid-size loan program, with the unemployment insurance issues, and some other spending items. Now is the time to engage with those on the Senate side in particular on your issues and your policy positions.
So I have one more question for you, Wes, that is in keeping with what we're going to talk with Lucy about in just a minute, which is this idea of digital civil society is more relevant now in the midst of COVID than it had been before. Even in this idea of how do you do advocacy and lobbying and education of policymakers while continuing to social distance. Usually you take advantage of members being at home in their districts because you go see them in person. So I'm just curious, can you provide an example of something you've seen that's been particularly effective or interesting that people have been doing as they try to take what used to be face-to-face relationship building conversations to a virtual format?
Yeah, just in my work, usually, and with the public policy team at an independent sector, we would be kind of meeting with, House and Senate staff, going to their offices, set up meetings and meeting with them about issues, leaving behind a paper on the position and kind of work with them on legislation face-to-face. But now it's all Zoom conference calls, that sort of thing with members. One thing would be interesting to also kind of point out is that, when members would kind of want to announce a big policy, they would kind of put together a press conference, on the Capitol with all the press around and TV cameras and people in the room asking questions live. We had on Tuesday a good event with actually 5 senators. Senator Langford, Senator Coons kind of leading the effort to push forward legislation to expand the charitable deduction that was part of the CARES Act. And that event took place over a video conference with those 5 senators, basically in their homes, basically, going in digitally and making their speech and their statement, and then asking a few questions, and then that was it. No press questions, no other TV cameras there. It was a nice event, but it was all, all digital. So that's kind of where we're going. Members are doing that. Staff are doing that. I mean, across the board, everyone's kind of doing that in this day and age.
Thanks, Wes, for that example. I think we're seeing a lot of these adaptations, but I think what we're learning is they still work. So although it feels a little foreign when we start, we wind up in the right place.
Exactly, that's true.
All right, so Wes, you've helped tee us up to talk about why we need to be discussing digital policy in civil society right now. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce formally Lucy Bernholz, Director of Digital Civil Society Lab at the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. The lab investigates the challenges and opportunities for civil society to thrive in the digital age. Welcome, Lucy.
Thanks for having me.
So Lucy, you recently have done a comprehensive study of the broad range of digital policy issues that impact nonprofits. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found and how those findings, what those findings mean in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure. I want to say from the beginning that the Digital Civil Society Lab, which we started in 2014 officially, I very much think of as being a voice amplifier for community expertise that is existed and been catalyzed and been working on these issues since the mid-1980s, probably at the latest, probably earlier. So while we now say, and in a sense, set up the lab to argue, among other things, to make the case that digital policy is civil society's policy agenda, that work has roots that go back decades. And we're building on that expertise. And I think what COVID is doing is making every goldfish aware of the water in which she's swimming. And by that, I think the goldfish in that metaphor are both not-for-profit organizations, foundations, donors, but most importantly, each of us as a person. There is not a single domain of societal life that exists right now that is not dependent on digital technologies. And since the nonprofit sector, which is independent sector's core constituency, cares about that realm, there really isn't a domain. And I'll run off a couple of examples just to give you a sense. We could not have this conversation. You could not do the advocacy that Wes was just talking about. And it's absolutely critical to understand that there are enormous numbers of people in our country who can't participate in this space. So if this is the new space for advocacy and learning and healthcare and banking and shopping, and we're deliberately or well, I'll say deliberately leaving people out of those spaces. And here I'm not just talking about not-for-profit organizations, I'm talking about people. Then we have a private public sphere. We don't have a public sphere. So that's the really broad sense. COVID examples, I mean, in about, I think it was 2015, a not-for-profit organization called Education Superhighway got started. Its goal was to connect every American public school to fiber, to appropriate fiber. I believe they're at 99% of American public schools in 5 years. They're actually going to close down the nonprofit. They've achieved their goal. That's an extraordinary success, except kids aren't in school right now. That we've gotten the schools wired, but not the kids. The kids don't have access. So just here in my hometown of San Francisco, there's a school up the street that's actually the first school of entry for new immigrants to the city school district. Because kids go through that school in just a year or two before they transition into the regular schools. There's actually a neighborhood PTA called Comadres that serves instead of a traditional PTA. They're busy figuring out ways to not just advocate to the school board to get Wi-Fi hotspots into the homes and homeless shelters and cars where those families are living, but the neighbors are doing it themselves. So that's digital policy, and it's both physical access and advocacy to the school district. We heard all about telehealth. A lot of people, there's been a lot of debate. I've seen a lot of news coverage about the food supply. One of the things I think particularly urban dwellers rarely think about is the beginning of that food supply. So the people who are growing our food and picking our food and packing that food, not just the people who are delivering it to your door if you're using that, that's entirely now, almost entirely driven by digital networked technologies, both for the workers who are delivering it to your door if you're using that. And most important, as I've learned from a colleague, Samir Doshi in the San Mateo Food Alliance, the actual work of the people in the fields is being dictated by digital systems. So there's a whole area in which the likely category of interest for the sector is the FDA, the Department of Agriculture, right? So it's pervasive. Certainly in some of the first sort of mainstream, not necessarily digitally oriented parts of the nonprofit sector to really understand and lead on integrating digital issues into their core work is the civil rights and racial justice community, who've been at this since, well, from the very beginning, one could argue. The ACLU has been a leader on these issues, again, going back to the late 1980s. This is not new, or even before the 1970s. But in Minneapolis itself, a city that a lot of us have been paying a lot of attention to, Elizabeth Adams, who's a technologist, is leading the efforts to have a tech stream that runs through the work of the city council's racial equity strategic plan. So there is no part of our lives as people that aren't touched by a dependence on digital systems. And I think there's kind of two ways to think about this. There are those domain specific policies, education, health, racial justice, criminal justice, food supply, you name it. And embedded in all of those typical policy areas are digital concerns. And then there are concerns for the space of the nonprofit and philanthropic sector itself, what I refer to as civil society, but that's a contested term and we can call it other things if you want, but I call it civil society. And I should say, all of civil society is digital civil society. This is not, when we use that term, we're not talking about organizations that have specific digital policy agendas or about wiring schools or getting hotspots to people. That's not digital civil society. Your food bank, your animal shelter, your museum, your library, your after-school program, we could run through independent sector's membership list and I can tell you what their digital policies are.
So that is far-reaching.
Yes.
It almost makes me think, where would you begin if you wanted to understand and start becoming more strategic and following or even advocating around different digital policies?
So again, the answer to that question depends on who you are. If you are a after school program, you already are familiar, you're already an expert on the local or state education, health, human services policies that may shape your work. So you're already in it. Or if you're an immigrant rights activist or organization, you know the immigration law, if you're already doing policy. The trick is to figure out, how do I build expertise on the digital side of that? And this is what the report you mentioned at the top, which is called Integrated Advocacy and is available for free on the lab's website, looked at. And here's the thing about the nonprofit sector in the United States. The expertise about digital justice exists within the nonprofit sector. That's actually where it's coming from. And again, where it's been coming from for the last 40 years. So librarians, for example, public librarians tend to be, and public libraries tend to be very smart about information systems and information law. They have an enormous number of resources. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, the American Civil Liberties Union, these are multi-issue organizations that have led policy expertise and policy advocacy on digital issues, again, for decades. They may not exist in every community like public librarians do, but their expertise is available online. There's an entire distributed network, just like there's a health sector and a food sector and an education sector, there is this digital expertise and it exists in civil society. We have nurtured it. It is part of the nonprofit sector. They are our peers. So the expertise is out there, absolutely.
So one of my questions is, when you look at, you kind of divided it into two buckets, which is there's the digital policy expertise is some sort of topically related or related to an organization's mission. And there are digital policies embedded in that work that organizations need to understand. And then there's digital policy that is related to basically how we as a sector function generally, which is more kind of the work of independent sector or similar types of infrastructure organizations. What are some of the digital policies that cut across all types of institutions and civil society? Or maybe the better question is, what is sort of the most pressing of those issues right now that we should be paying attention to?
Well, like everything else, pressing is, has many definitions, but so I go back to answer this question. I think we have to go back to first principles, which is what's the nonprofit sector for? Or more specifically, what is independent sector for? And independent sector is a fabulous example of this because of your name. The idea that this space is actually somehow independent from, well, from what? Well, usually from governments or marketplaces. But here's the thing, and here's what we say about the Digital Civil Society Lab. Because we are all entirely dependent on commercially built and surveilled technologies that are also government surveilled, I would really appreciate it if someone would point out to me where the independence is. That's how significant the problem is. I'll make a joke of it, but I'm quite serious. The sector is entirely dependent on global digital networks that we do not control and that do in fact control us. So what's the most pressing policy issues there? All of the policy issues that are in a sense about protecting the individual agency and independent private ability to assemble and express ourselves. Those are the first principles. And in, for 100 years or so, a significant part of that work has been protecting this corporate structure called the not-for-profit organization, which has legal protections that provide it certain privileges and allow it to do certain things. In the digital age, those same protections are necessary, but they may take the form of making sure that you can have a private conversation in order to take collective action. Where does that happen nowadays? On encrypted messaging apps. It's not happening on this call. This call, by the way, is not encrypted. So if you want to have a private conversation to organize for collective action, that's an issue of encryption. We hear a lot about privacy in the digital age. There were some significant activities in the state of California yesterday about that. But privacy regulation is incredibly important. Mm-hmm. Laws about data management and data rights and data regulation, just who gets to do what with the digitized information that actually represents both people and organizational activities. So one of the biggest shifts here, I mean, there's a lot of specific issues. I will mention one that I think is critically important. I'll come back to it, remind me if I don't, but I think it's really about shifting our understanding from domains of policy. So if the domains of policy have typically been tax law, corporate law, charitable law, those don't disappear, but we also now to think about privacy, assembly, expression, and those domains. And then there's a number of issues that cut across them, and key among them being intellectual property.
Mm.
But right now, I'll give you a very pressing, very real example that makes both, I hope, makes both the scale of the opportunity and its multifacetedness clear. Civil society, not-for-profit organizations are fundamentally about helping people come together to take action. And you need a place to do that. You need a physical place to do that. And we talk about Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park or park benches and things like that, or, you know, the privacy of built spaces. That space where we are doing this now, whether we're talking about doing it online in a privatized space like we're having this conversation, or in Lafayette Park yesterday, 2 days ago, those physical spaces are also now full of digital sensors, from the cameras that are everywhere, to the building tags that you need to get in and out of a space, to your parking app. They look like they're physical public spaces, but they are being privatized around us just as rapidly and with as little fanfare as over the last 10 years, we rapidly moved almost all conversations onto platforms like this. So we need to protect our right to assembly and the ability to make sure that there's actually a space for people to take collective action, peaceful collective action. And that is enmeshed in that statement is everything from encryption to privacy to the fight against facial recognition technologies. And it is an asymmetric battle. Not, you know, there's extraordinary things have happened and are happening because of technology, because of these technologies. Let's be very clear. The killers of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd would not be being prosecuted if it weren't for cell phone cameras. I don't think there's any doubt about that. That's the power in the hands of the people. But the state and the corporations have universal databases that they use for facial recognition and very advanced artificial intelligence to make sense of that. That's a David and Goliath problem right there. So as you're thinking about where does independent sector start, I think it's really about your whole frame of policy domains, because we're operating in digitized spaces, whether we're talking about being on Zoom or you're talking about being in Lafayette Park. And if that space gets continues to be dominated by private corporations and kind of invisible surveillance by governments, then we really have a very significant challenge on our hand for the idea of an independent sector.
Oh my gosh, Lucy, you just gave us so much to think about. One of the things that strikes me in the example you give about the physical organizing, sort of the place-based organizing that we're seeing right now is, I think a lot of people in the sector feel we are more empowered because of the technology that we have, both, to your point, technology that we can use to hold government officials accountable, technology we can use to organize these types of events, but we are not aware of all of the other decisions that are being made about how we're able to use that technology that may be infringing upon our ability to assemble. I don't think that that's something, at least for me personally, that I have a lot of awareness about. So I think there's a lot of education within the sector we may want to do in order to think about how this needs to move forward.
Well, let me comment on that, because here again, yes, there is a lot of education. We all need to keep learning, and this doesn't ever stay static. The digital environment keeps moving. But again, expertise about this exists in communities as well as in schools of public policy, right? Over-policed communities, Black and brown communities, have been over-surveilled in this country for 400 years. They know how to find surveillance, and they know how to educate themselves and others. So here I want to reference the work of a new organization called AI for the People, led by a woman named Mutali Nkande, again, a not-for-profit organization, right in the midst of our sector, right? Working on these issues of what real tech literacy means. And it's not just about knowing how to mute yourself on Zoom. In fact, it has very little with knowing about how to mute yourself on Zoom. It's understanding who makes Zoom, who's Zoom, and what are they doing with what we're doing here, right? So there's organizations like that that we can learn from and listen to. There's an extraordinary amount of expertise, particularly on the use of personal technologies in protest and in organizing and in mobilizing. There's an enormous amount of work being done on disinformation and free expression, and all of that. I want to be very clear. That work is happening in civil society. In some new research we're doing, we're actually doing a media study of who do journalists talk to about the privacy issues related to contact tracing apps related to COVID, back to your beginning. Well, you know who they talk to? A lot of organizers and experts from not-for-profit groups that have been working on privacy protections, consent issues for decades, right? A lot of them are both the ones building those tools and the ones making sure that if you're a state government and you're thinking about implementing that tool, that you do so with a very clear plan to stop using it. That advocacy is coming from your membership. So the expertise is there.
I know we're running a little long on time, but there's two important questions I want to make sure I ask you before we wrap up. So if folks want to hang in there with us, we're going to try to get to them. One is, Lucy, you've raised this a couple of times. I think this applies not just to digital policy, but the pandemic crisis has forced us to pay attention to issues that we've long been aware of exist. We just haven't prioritized them. And so one of the ones that is coming up related to digital policy, although you said this is not the definition of digital policy, but it's a question that a colleague of ours has raised. He says, my organization has developed a large volume of digital educational and learning resources for the public. But due to the digital divide, many of our 120 plus community-based outreach partners deal with clients who have no access to these assets because they cannot access the hardware, which is important, or the internet for connectivity. So should accessing the digital divide on a national level become a priority for our sector? And I've heard this question more in the context of COVID than in the probably 7 years prior that I've been working in independent sector. So I want to throw that.
Well, absolutely, because go back to my education superhighway example. We wired the schools, we didn't wire the people, right? Everyone in your related, as part of the independent sector community who's been trying to work from home in the last 3 months, suddenly discovered, boy, does that, crazy Bernholz who's been talking about digital governance and digital security for your organization, how do you do that for everybody's house, right? That is the issue. Should broadband access, should equal access to the hardware and software and networks that we rely on be a priority for the sector? Absolutely. It goes back because that's the public sphere. If you and Wes are right, and that's where we have access to our elected officials, then that's a right. Then actually it's a moral obligation as a supposed democracy to make sure that people can access their public officials. But to say, which is also to say access education, access food, access healthcare these days. So absolutely. It's not enough, but if you want to start there,
right.
The place to start.
The lesson we're taking away is we should at least be doing that and probably much more. I will say from an independent sector standpoint, we have taken a position on federal funding, increasing federal funding to bridge the digital divide and increase access to technology, physical technology, to technical support and internet connectivity, because we view this as an equity issue, which I think Lucy so adeptly explained just now. So I have one last question for you, Lucy. I don't actually want to wrap this up because I have actually 50 more questions, but one important one is you've mentioned that the players who are making a lot of decisions around digital policy are both government and the marketplace, private sector corporations. And so I want to ask about advocacy. This feels like an issue where there's a unique opportunity. Lots of times with advocacy, when we do an update of how are we doing on advocacy, we ask Wes and say, Wes, what is happening in Washington, D.C.? How will we lobby the officials or legislators, sometimes regulators, if we really have to talk to them. But on this policy, it doesn't seem like that is the only audience we should be talking to, nor necessarily where our most recent successes lie either.
Right, absolutely. There's very much a triangulated relationship now for advocates about any issue, and that is some of the issues are framed by public policy, some of them are framed by corporate policy, some of them are really shaped by product design choices. And that's true on many, many issues. So the basic change or new opportunity for advocacy is to recognize that you're advocating in at least two different directions, to state actors and to corporations. That opens up a whole new set of strategies. It does require a new set of skills. It does require some hard conversations for organizations because the sector writ large has been seduced by free software and hardware donations. Let's be very clear. So that's an issue. But there's, again, it's not blank canvas at this point. We have extraordinary examples of mi gente and tech workers coming together because it brings new allies. There are a lot of people within these companies who can be your allies in making these changes happen. So witness.org has some extraordinary examples of working with engineers at YouTube, right? So there's new kinds of alliances. I think the most important thing to think about advocacy here is, and this is why we titled the paper Integrated Advocacy, there's new coalitions to be built. You've got new kinds of partners, but those are trusted relationships that take time to build. But they can include things from the Uber drivers to the workers at the big companies to the housing advocates in a community, to the digital policy experts. They're really going to bring together some important new relationships. They have to be built on trust. The nonprofit sector has the advantage of being home to so much of that, that there's a little bit of trust underneath that maybe that could be activated. And also to realize that advocacy is going to take place in very different spaces. It's not just at the kind of within the federal government's octopus-like different organizations and structures legislatively and from a regulatory perspective, but at the state level and directly with corporations. So I'll give you a funny story, but a real one, and I'd never heard this before. Greenpeace in Australia, which was leading a campaign about mineral extraction, led a very successful effort to advocate against the banks in Australia by actually essentially staging a protest in the comment section of the app store where the banks try to get their customers to use their apps. And they used that space to mobilize people to leave comments and reviews of the app in such quantities that the bank's technology people, no doubt, because you know it wasn't the CEOs watching that, brought that word to the leadership at the bank and said, you know, essentially that was the bank's doorstep for this advocacy. It wasn't a protest in physical space, it was an entirely digital space, and they were able to get meetings with the leaders of the banks that they were trying to work with. So you've got a broad canvas on which to draw. And I think really the thing to understand, and here I've learned this as much from Tawana Petty in Detroit as from anyone, this work is happening. People are making these, their demands, they're voicing their demands. It's up to us to figure out how to hear them.
I think that that comment applies not only to digital policy, but I think it rings true for a lot of topics that are top of mind right now. Lucy, thank you so much for your insightful comments. They scare me a little because I know what's ahead of me. In terms of, I think I have work that I need to start doing, but I at least feel like I have a place to start, and I have a resource, which is your new report, which we're going to include a link to your report in the recording of this webinar when we send it out to everybody tomorrow. So thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Wes. Thank you, everybody, for participating in today's webinar, and we look forward to talking to everyone next week.